Welcome back to our study of apologetics. And we're going to be looking at lecture 2 this week out of week 2. And if you have looked at your syllabus already, then you know that we're going to be looking at chapters 3 and 4 of Chesterton's book on the everlasting man. And the chapters we're going to look at are called The Antiquity of Civilization, and then the next chapter deals with the issue of comparative religion. And those may seem like disparate, different topics to us, but the fact is that they're closely intertwined and interrelated. And even though in these chapters, Chesterton doesn't give us a window into his research, there has been a monumental amount of research done that corroborates many of the thoughts and ideas that he has right here in these chapters. You may have noticed one thing that I thought has been interesting through the first 4 chapters, and that is the degree to which he's bouncing his ideas off of the writings of H.G. Wells, particularly Wells's History of the World, but other works by Wells as well. Now, Wells is not part of the current canon that everybody has to read. But I grew up as a preteen and a teenager reading Wells's science fiction works. And it's interesting if you read like The Time Machine or War of the Worlds and then compare them with Wells's more scholarly works, he's really weaving together a tapestry out of common threads. Because if you get to the end of The Time Machine, not the end of the book, but once you get to the place where the time traveler has gone all the way into the future, something like 1 million years, there's nothing left of the earth except a dried up, desiccated, and smoking hulk, which is a picture of Wells's idea about life, which is that life is meaningless. And ultimately, there's no teleology. There's no end point for us. So I think it's interesting that he plays off of Wells, though he doesn't footnote him. And in this chapter, chapter 3, where he talks about the antiquity of civilization, he has some interesting discussions about the relationship between despotism and democracy. Now, the other person whom Chesterton is playing off against, not nearly as often indicated by him, but really is the work of Georg Hegel, an early 19th century German philosopher that we've looked at before, I talked about before. And Hegel, of course, had this evolutionary conception of history. 19th century was the century for evolution. And we only think often of Darwin and his biological views, but Hegel had an evolutionary view of human history as well. And so if you were to read Hegel's political works, for instance, you would find him saying that we've gone from despotism to democracy. But what Chesterton wants to argue is democracy is probably, or at least some form of it, is probably the oldest form of political governance. Because in the early days, and we do have some evidence for this, he takes us to Egypt and he takes us to Babylon, because those were the cultures that had a written language, 3000 BC. If you want to call it a language, the Egyptians had hieroglyphs and the Babylonians had cuneiform, but they've left behind documents. And he's all about, as you've seen in the first 2 chapters of this work, that we can't do history on prehistoric people because there's no data to work from except artifacts, archaeological artifacts, which he doesn't talk a lot about. But both Egypt and Babylon left behind for us written narratives. And especially in the Egyptian narratives, he makes the case that originally Egypt was the Nile River, and along the Nile were a variety of small communities, relatively small communities. In Greece, they might call them city-states. These communities had the need to trade with each other. At times they would engage in war, but there was ultimately a need for trade and for fostering a positive kind of communication. And one of the things that's characteristic of smaller communities is that people have a say. And so for him, democracy eventually devolves into despotism. In fact, there's a beautiful quote here where he says, a despotism may almost be defined as a tired democracy. As fatigue falls on a community, the citizens are less inclined for that eternal vigilance which has truly been called the price of liberty. And they prefer to arm only one single sentinel to watch the city while they sleep. So for him, democracy gets tired, and democratic states get too large for the democratic institutions to work well, at least in the ancient world. And as a result, they devolve into despotism. So it's the opposite direction. He's going to also indicate the same thing about religion when we get to that discussion here in a few moments. He talks about the fact that democracy is always breaking down. We can see this with Athens. The Athenians had a democratic city-state way back in the 5th and, in the 5th century BC. In the 6th century BC, it wasn't quite democratic, but they had acquired this democracy among a body of people that was probably about 120,000 people living in Attica, which is the city-state of which Athens was the capital. And they developed quite a remarkable civilization, democratic. But that democracy began to break down and eventually paved the way for one Greek despot, Alexander of Macedon, to become the conqueror who brought all the Greek city-states together, along with a great deal of Asia as well. And so he continues his tirade here in this chapter against the those, quote, intellectuals, as they would refer to themselves. Interesting how these two chapters dovetail with chapter 5, especially in the Guinness book that we've already read this week. Guinness talks about, he has the quote at the beginning from Paul Johnson about intellectuals and the failure of the intelligentsia or the intellectual community. He also, in this book, Back to Chesterton, then speculates on how some have thought that perhaps the oldest societies were matriarchal instead of patriarchal. There's at least some evidence that there were matriarchal communities like that. And, of course, with his usual wit, he decides to turn the tables on the, quote, caveman with the club and says maybe it was a cave woman with a club. But the point that he's trying to make throughout this chapter, and we're going to skip on to the next one next, is that the written text that we have from the ancient world, primarily Egyptian and Babylonian, give us a different understanding of the world than we would get through reading the social science works done by those who have been influenced by the Hegelian tradition. And that's just about everybody, even today. If you go to almost any university today, there will be this conception of the evolution of society that comes out very quickly. He also makes some interesting points when he attaches, in this chapter and the next, when he attaches the major developments, like the discovery of fire and the discovery of wheels, to the priesthood. He says that at least there's some evidence in the Egyptian literature that it was priests who did things like invent the wheel, rather than the anti-religious scientist. Even in places where the humor is not so much on the surface of the page, Chesterton's humor nonetheless does come out throughout this chapter. Now in chapter 4, God and Comparative Religion, he does much of the same sort of thing, though now with religions. And the Hegelian model, which spawned all kinds of other works, other books by other scholars in the 19th century, including Old Testament scholars like Julius Wellhausen, was that religion also started out as animistic and then became polytheistic and then henotheistic and eventually monotheistic. He suggests that that may not be the case. Now, I don't know whether he had been exposed to an important book that came out in 1932 by a man named Wilhelm Schmidt. Schmidt did he was an anthropologist, cultural anthropologist. So he dug in the ground and spent his entire life on one big project analyzing the religious traditions from literally around the world. It took him about 23 or 24 years to publish all of his findings. It came out in 12 volumes in German. It's the kind of thing you would expect Germans to produce. And in Wilhelm Schmidt's estimate, and he was not some kind of Bible-thumping fundamentalist, but in Schmidt's investigation, he concluded that when you dig down to the lowest strata in any archaeological investigation, you find that for the most part, they're monotheistic cultures. And then those devolved into spiritistic and animistic, and further into polytheistic and so on. And then it was only at a later time that the original monotheism was rediscovered. And so he doesn't mention Schmidt. This book was being written about the time that Schmidt's work was coming out, and so he may not have been familiar. Probably Schmidt's work was not translated. I don't know whether Chesterton was fluent in German or not. But it's a very interesting discussion in which he talks about paganism with its multiple deities, and his supposition that paganism grew out of monotheism, in the sense that if you go back and look at almost any pagan culture, that is polytheistic nature religion cultures, which is what paganism is all about, in virtually every one there's a high god. Talks about Australian Aborigines, talks about Native Americans, that Native Americans had this polytheistic culture, but back of it all was the Great Spirit that we've heard. If you've seen the film Last of the Mohicans, they do the chant at the beginning and then the chant at the end, in which they look to the Great Spirit. So this is a very helpful little exercise, even though it's written journalistically. It's not footnoted. He doesn't give you a lot of data that he has gleaned from reading original sources or from even looking at good secondary sources, but his intuitions, as always, are really good. And so he has here toward the end of the chapter a statement where he says, polytheism was really a sort of pool, in the sense of the pagans having consented to the pooling of their pagan religions. In other words, he's saying they're not very different from each other. They have different names for their gods. And if you're way up in the north in Scandinavia, you got to have an ice god. Whereas if you're down in the South Pacific, you have gods that are related to things that have nothing to do with ice. But Chesterton, again, helps us, I think, understand the nature of the human condition here, and even understand the nature of the human condition in its search for civilization and in its search for God and truth.